we'll have a panel discussion, and then we will be starting with it now. And then at 6:30 UK time, we'll start with a fireside chat with the founder of BOLT. And afterwards, we'll be doing virtual networking, so you are up for a treat. Now, without any further ado, please let me bring on stage Petar Savic, the co-director of Startup Grind, who will introduce the panelists to you. Peter?
Hey, good evening. Thank you so much, Marian, for your kind intro. My name is Petar, co-director of Startup Grind London, and this October we're supporting Black Leaders Month globally in all our 650 chapters. And it gives me a great pleasure to have a panel this evening with some amazing Black leaders and also some good friends. So yeah, without any further ado, I would like to bring to the stage Fluet, who is a partner at Silkin. He's also a mentor, advisor to many companies that are disrupting digital media using high tech. He's a founder that built his own legal practice and also an advisory firm in parallel. So it gives me a great pleasure to have Cliff here on the stage tonight.
Good evening, Peter.
Hello, Cliff. Yeah, and also we have Gary Stewart, who is a founder and CEO of Nest Founders, and he's ex-CEO of Vira by Telefonica. Gary, good evening.
Good evening. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure always to have you on our event. You've been around for quite a few times with us on the Startup Grind stage, and it's always great to have you. And we also have Kenneth Siber, who is WeWork Labs head of UK and Ireland. And then Kenneth is also ex-founder, as I may say. He built a company and exited to Fujitsu, and it's really fantastic to have you all on board. So because we only have a half an hour to discuss the topic of tonight, which is learning for founders, let's just get straight into it, and potentially you can say something about yourself. Cliff, would you like to start, please?
Yeah, so thanks for the opportunity, Peter. So as mentioned by you, I mean, my role in the world of digital media for the last 25 years has been working with disruptive companies. For years, I worked in industries, and now I'm a partner at a law firm, Silkin, where virtually all of my clients are in the world of digital media. And I also run an advisory firm which focuses on disruptors, working with incumbents and insurgents. And I'm particularly interested in working with founders and boards in order to crack the most difficult challenges.
Amazing, thank you. Gary, would you like to say more about you and the Nest?
Yeah, no, so the Nest kind of really addresses the problem of overlooked founders, the idea being that, you know, the vast majority of founders out there will never get funded or really kind of even looked at by investors. And people kind of think that that's cool. And I guess what we're saying is you can use technology to actually empower entrepreneurs, not just to learn how the game is played, but then to be put in touch with the right people as well, whether those be mentors, coaches, other entrepreneurs, or investors.
Amazing. And then finally, Kenneth, would you like to tell us more about your work and what do you do at WeWork Labs?
Well, that'll be a very long story, but yeah, I think as you know, as you said, we're here at WeWork, you know, and working on supporting founders in the innovation ecosystem across the UK and Ireland. I think WeWork, hopefully, at least to this audience, doesn't need much of an introduction. And yeah, prior to WeWork, as you mentioned, I started my own companies and invested in some and build a few other accelerators. And yeah, that's what's going on right now.
Well, yeah, thank you so much. So let me ask you a first question, and it's to do with, do you believe that there are natural entrepreneurs that were just born with it, or this might be a skill that we can develop and learn? Anyone wants to go first? Cliff.
I'll take that one, Peter. So I think that there are definitely some common traits with successful entrepreneurs. There's a resilience, there's a natural curiosity, there's a questioning of the status quo. The best entrepreneurs do as much listening as they do talking. I meet lots of entrepreneurs that do a lot of talking and not a lot of listening. But also as well, they're the ones who understand the importance of maintaining and building on a network. that the best entrepreneurs are the ones who work in parallel and in concert rather than on their own. Now, it's almost like a band. Everyone looks at the front man, but actually it's the people who've got the tightest band, the best support structures and the networks. And that's been, I think, one of the challenges that entrepreneurs have, which is access. One of the themes that are being looked at by Startup Grind and Black History Month is how do you build that network when you aren't born into it, or you didn't go to the right schools, or you've come as an immigrant, or you've come as someone who's a refugee. How you build those, how you tap into those. They are systems that can be hacked. And I don't mean that in the pejorative sense. I mean just accessed, really. And I think enhanced access and platforms is a huge part of the problem, and actually what we can look to solve using technology as well. So with platforms like the Nest have a huge role to play, I think.
Well, thanks for the shout out. I mean, I think what I was going to say is I think sometimes when we ask that question, it's really kind of like a bias for people in the West, right? Because in certain countries, and even in this country, some people don't have a choice but to try and figure out if they can set up a business because the other systems are kind of like closed to them. And so I think that's one thing I would say. And I would say that the second thing is that, like, yeah, I do think that some entrepreneurs are born in the sense that they have like a certain risk profile and a certain willingness to be disruptive. But I don't think that's, in law, you would say it's necessary but not sufficient. So it's kind of like you do need to have a willingness to take a risk and to just really just think differently about the way the world operates. But that's just kind of like the beginning. Then it takes like about 10 to 15 years of just grind and dedication. And I think that there are a lot of people who may not have the initial risk appetite, but they do have this other portion, which is kind of like the ability to work really hard at something. And at the end of the day, I almost think that that's kind of more important, because you can find someone to partner with who's going to be that risk taker, but that risk taker is only useful in a company for a certain amount of time. After a while, it's just a company.
Yeah, I think you're quite right, Gary, and I think it's the same question as whether they are born athletes or born anything else, right? It's no much more there are some people who are such talented entrepreneurs that they can be lazy, and then there are such lazy entrepreneurs that are so super talented, they don't have to do much. And then there are people who work so hard who may not be the most talented entrepreneurs, but just have this sort of the drive, the dedication, the willingness to work all hours, and they overcome the fact that they may not be as naturally talented as I don't know, Mark Zuckerberg or whoever we might point to. But I also think, as Gary said, right, there's a difference between being an entrepreneur or starting a company and being a successful entrepreneur, right? There are people who are born, I think there are people who are born unable to work for other people. And I think a lot of the entrepreneurs I know, and perhaps I was like that as well, used to be like that, unable to work for other people, therefore with no other option if you actually want to pay the bills than to start a company. Then actually being successful and good at doing it is a different kettle of fish.
Amazing. I just want to follow on what Cliff mentioned, and this is resilience. So how has resilience and some other skills you gain through entrepreneurship help you elsewhere in life, especially nowadays when we live in a crisis?
Well, I think resilience really is. I think if you could teach your kids, and I've got a couple, if you could teach your kids one thing, right? For me, actually, the whole point of going to school is learning, resilience and I guess a degree of social interaction. A lot of the actual topics, I don't know, I may kind of reveal something I shouldn't, right? But I think, I've certainly forgotten, more than I can remember, and I think that goes for most of us. But I think learning to fail, right, and kind of being in a safe environment where failing is okay. I think that's kind of for me the point of the best education and the best schools, right? And that sort of resilience, I think is invaluable.
Yeah, I'd also add to that, as well as resilience, a certain laterality. So one of the things is that the best entrepreneurs don't accept the status quo. They understand it. They don't want to disrupt something without understanding it first and then thinking laterally. I think that laterality plus resilience occupies an opportunity for people to be able to become inventive. That's where businesses are born. That's when new business models are born. That's when people can spot an opportunity, and rather than look at it from the position of incumbency and see something as a disruption, see it genuinely as an opportunity. So that opportunity to basically growth hack and be able to tap into these new worlds very much come from having the opportunity and the willingness to fail. Kenneth's completely right. You know, one of the things that disturbs me a little bit about learning modules these days is kids being told that there is an answer, rather than actually seeing them as being people that need to be able to find a solution. So I think that those elements, I think, are utterly important. And resilience is essentially the opportunity to take failure as a learning rather than as some life judgment. And I've seen some people never get over that, and other people realize this was just version 1.0. I'll move on.
No, very well said. Thank you for sharing that. And while we are on this situation, how, especially you, Kenneth, how has this current situation impacted your sector when you're talking about the co-working and a kind of physical location ones? And, you know, in sense of that, how do you see that future of work, you know, moving forwards?
We haven't really noticed any change, Petar. Pretty much business as normal over here. I don't know what you're talking about. No, it's as you can imagine, it's been madness. And I think you know, if you look at well, there's two things, right? There's the future of office and how people work, and then there's the future of co-working specifically. And I'm not necessarily going to make myself an expert on the future of work. You know, I think some of the stuff we've seen coming in from our clients, right, is that some of the kind of big high rise, the sort of way of working where we'd all go into one large space and all be together in one space, every day, Monday to Friday, that's probably gone for a while. And what people are coming, at least to WeWork, for is flexibility. Flexibility both in terms of where people can work and when they can work and how they can work. So a lot of, at least our enterprise clients, are using much more collaboration spaces, sort of seeing London and our spaces as large campuses from where, and sort of letting their employees find a place of work. Because I think a lot of people are also kind of coming to terms with the fact that the home working experiment does become less fun after the kind of initial couple of months goes out of it, and we're sitting in our kitchens and someone is assembling flat pack furniture upstairs and the kids are shouting and the Amazon doorbell man is ringing. I think people need a space to work, right? But they don't want to commute as far. They don't want to be all in big spaces. I think flexibility it will become really interesting, right? And I think that also kind of brings it around some challenges for the next generation of working, right? Because we are all leveraging our social connections from having worked for a while, those of us who've got a bit of gray hair. I think, the next generation is going to have to find a different way of building trust and connections if they are not together in the office every day. And how that looks, I'm not sure anyone really knows yet.
Well, thank you for sharing. What do you think, Cliff? How is this situation impacting your business? I presume you have more business than usual because everyone needs kind of legal services in these days.
Well, provided they use the right law firm, Peter, then yeah. No. My own practice, I pivoted to digital anyway. One of the things that I hadn't really quite understood was just how much incumbency and a sort of almost kind of industries and sectors that my clients were looking to disrupt were sort of happy to cruise along. And then along comes a significant sort of black swan event like COVID. And I would absolutely aver we've seen 5 years innovation in 5 months. There are companies who are getting investment, companies who are getting proof of concepts out there, because every single company is having to rethink its model. And then from the other shape of the lens, as I'm on the board at Silkin and essentially the chief innovation officer, the opportunity for quite a small C conservative sector like legal services, having to rethink how people work, what the environment is, how they collaborate, what the tools are. And that has also been a massive boost to internal innovation as well. So internally and externally, and with the clients that we're looking to do, and people looking to embrace things that were very, very scary, like artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, edge computing, the adoption of 5G in order to allow collaboration, all of these tools being, and understanding how much we're all being held back by the latency of our existing networks is creating a huge impetus for disruption.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I have a question for you, Gary, and it is about how did you bring your team together, and then how how did you manage to build such a diverse team in a way that, you know, you just recently launched the new app and you kind of move from that big corporate role running via accelerator. So could you tell me more about your kind of team building and how you managed to build such a diverse team?
Yeah, no, I think there's definitely been some lessons along the way. I think that like when you run a team at a corporate, like you can be a little bit more lax. I think by the time I left Wire, we were like about like 20 or 30 people or something. So you can be a bit more lax. You know, people have like a kind of it's not really on them. It's kind of like if there are mistakes being made, well, you know, ha ha ha, we have like a big budget, we're cool. I think that when you're at a startup, it's a really different thing. I found that I've become a lot more brutal at a startup, meaning that like people are either there to help you or they're there to hurt you. And unfortunately, that's kind of the way it is. It's like someone's either kind of helping you to extend your runway or they're eating up your runway. And so I think that for me, that's kind of the number one lesson I've learned, which is that I kind of need people, regardless of skin color or anything else, who are just really entrepreneurial and adding value all the time. I guess it's what Reed Hastings called the keeper test. You know, he said he couldn't have built Netflix if he didn't have people who he could just trust to get on with it without kind of being micromanaged. And so that's what I'm really looking for. At the same time, I'm always still trying to make sure that I'm kind of looking into deeper pools of talent. So I'm not only looking into the people in the networks that I already have, I'm also looking to kind of use other networks. So before I was on this call, there's a network called the McKinsey Black Network, where they kind of bring together kind of like executives from different corporates. And I was on that last year. So essentially now when I kind of need to kind of make sure I'm being diverse, I would send out the job description, not just on LinkedIn, but also to different networks. If I want a woman founder or a woman partner, I'm also going to do the same thing. So I kind of just make sure that I'm holding myself accountable to the very highest standards, because if not, that's actually going to kill my business. But at the same time, I'm not just limiting it to the pools of people that I know. I'm always kind of making a very conscious effort to play in new pools of people and talent.
Yeah, it's really, really good points. Thank you for sharing that. And when we're talking about the mentors, advisors, and networks of people, you mentioned some of the interesting mentors. What do you think? How important and are those strong connections? You obviously, all of you have a very good connections, and especially in WeWork Labs, I believe you have fantastic connections to mentors and investors. How important is to have those, and especially when it comes to mentoring?
Well, I think I actually didn't have an awful lot of mentors when I started my first businesses, but I wish I did. And I guess one of the reasons for doing stuff around accelerators and sort of the WeWork Labs and the stuff we do is that I can see how valuable it would have been. To be honest, when I started my business, and this longer ago, it didn't even cross my mind that actually, you could get a mentor, or that there were things like, there weren't really that many accelerators. I think Techstars had just about gotten started, but there wasn't that ecosystem of support that you can find today. And so every single mistake I made, and trust me, I made many, and I even made some of the same mistakes twice, which you're not supposed to do. And some of them were very costly. I think, if you have a good mentor or a good sort of ecosystem around you, you can just accelerate your business much faster, and you can avoid, some of the stupid mistakes, right? Some of the stupid mistakes around first, as Gary was talking, hiring the first people, about finding the first couple of hires, which is so crucial. It kills you or boosts you forward, right? There are some actually things that mentors who've done it before will have known and experienced, and can help you with how do you raise money, how do you structure your cap tables, all these things. I think finding good mentors is absolutely worth its weight in gold.
Yeah, and I would say
that's really good to know. Yeah, please continue, Gary.
And I was going to say, sorry to interrupt. Beyond the mentors, it's like me now as a founder, the most important thing is money. You know what I mean? Like I love advice, but I love money even more. Because the thing is that, like, at the end of the day, I think it's something like 82% of startups will die because of a lack of cash flow. So that really is the gasoline that keeps the whole thing running. And there's no worse feeling than worrying how you're going to get to the end of the month when you have a business. That's your number one preoccupation. So I think that the difficulty is that, like, the vast majority of founders won't get funded. And those founders that will get funded probably had a warm intro or a relationship with the person that's going to fund them. I think the research in Silicon Valley says even stuff like if male investors that have a daughter are more likely to invest in women. So it is kind of like all of this like touchy-feely stuff.
Interesting.
Not, you kind of are thinking, oh my God, it's a total level playing field. It isn't really a level playing field. It's who you know. Venture capital was basically begun by people, groups of friends who had worked together, kind of like pooling their capital and then investing in other people. And I think to this day, it still kind of remains that way, which is essentially these closed networks of people who kind of are like each other and like each other and support each other and people like them. And for you to break into that, if you don't come from those networks, I think is really difficult. So it requires a very conscious and constant effort to try and expand your networks in order to make sure that you even have a chance of funding. If not, you're going to keep hearing the answer, oh, well, you're too early or we don't know. And you're going to be like, how'd that company over there get funded, though? I mean, they seem to be even earlier than I am. Well, it's because they probably knew someone or they knew someone who knew someone and that person was willing to vouch for them. And so they got the money and you're still just working hard.
Yeah,
that's really important to say. And you, Cliff, you also, I mean, I know you mentor at many places, including Abbey Road's Studio Incubator. And then tell us more about your experience of mentoring and connecting it to investors further.
I completely agree with everything that Kenneth and Gary said, just to be clear. So let me just add a different lens on it. I think that given it's Black History Month, which is one of the themes of this chat today, is actually the importance of people who look like you or understand where you came from. So I was born of extremely modest means, and I'm euphemizing wildly there. I came from the wrong part of London. I didn't have any obvious benefits at all. So working with female founders, working with people from diverse backgrounds, people being able to empathize and relate with you, which is essentially what networking is, and that, of course, is what ultimately leads to what Gary's talking about, which is about the money. But actually the opportunity to mentor people who can give you a form of leadership, can give you support and empathy. And as a mentor, I see it totally as a two-way deal. I learn at least as much from those that I mentor and vice versa. So for me, I think it's an extraordinarily important part of the digital media ecosystem and entrepreneurism. And actually, it's what opens up the money, it's what allows the collaboration, and it's what helps businesses grow.
Yeah, very well said. And you mentioned money, Gary mentioned investors. So how difficult is to find investors these days? And what would be the best way of fundraising in this momentum? Kenneth, I know your WeWork organizes demo days usually. What was the situation now? How do you see any traction there?
I think Gary might be the more recent expert on this, because he's actually been out there fundraising recently. Whilst I'm sitting comfortably on the sideline watching the show. I sense, from what I'm seeing, right, I think the challenge is the money is all out there, right? The money is still all out there, right? And there's huge amounts of dry powder. And if you listen to a lot of the investors, they say they're still investing. I think that is probably largely, I was going to find a word you can use on Zoom and not be edited out, but I'm not sure it's entirely true that they still are, for lack of a more direct way of saying it. I do, think that if you are, I think the challenge I think we're seeing, right, is that if you have a very early stage idea, you can actually get funded. I think that's where the money is going, right? So the things that, people are kind of looking, well, the world is going to stand still for a year and a half. So let's invest in really innovative stuff that perhaps is unproven. I think that's where you can get some money. Unfortunately, probably, as Gary says, can get that money more easily if you are already part of the establishment. It's still going to be hard if you're not. The growth funding, I think, is hard right now because there isn't any growth anywhere, really, apart from a few sectors, right? So a lot of the VCs who would have previously invested in something that had decent growth metrics are probably holding off on that a bit to kind of see where their own portfolios go. So yeah, I think it's a really tough climate out there, but I think Gary might have a even more recent perspective.
Yeah, no, thanks for that, Ken. It's like, so this morning I was on another call. I'm on the board of One Tech, and we were talking about this. And I think that what John Spindler said, and I haven't independently verified it, is that right now the market is really difficult for, like, the angels have basically kind of like disappeared. They're all kind of really nervous, holding on to their cash, trying to keep their jobs. It might change somewhat as we kind of get to the end of the tax year, and they might see some benefit in like EIS and SEIS. A lot of the VCs have kind of retrenched as well. So there's a lot of money that's being invested in Series A and Series B, but there's not as much money being spent on early stage or pre-revenue companies. So that's the big challenge right now, which is that like the VCs are basically saying, okay, well, it's a moment of like triage, or at least not all of them. I mean, a certain percentage of them, or the majority, I would say, are basically saying, let's retrench. Let me kind of double down on the companies that I think are my winners, right? And then the companies that are their losers, maybe they're not really focusing on that much, or they're cutting, or whatever the case may be. And then beyond that, you have people just not really that willing to take a risk on early stage investments, particularly if, but the angels are basically, because what I'm finding right now is you're trying to talk to the angels. And first of all, it's always been really difficult to identify angels. They're completely kind of like disaggregated. So how do you find an angel? How do you know if someone actually really has money, or if they're just calling themselves an angel because they like to pretend that they're rich? So you have to do that. In the old world, you could do this in a face-to-face meeting. Now you're trying to do it via Zoom calls or online lists and stuff like that. So I think the big challenge right now is for early stage founders, pre-revenue founders, finding people who still have a risk appetite and the money to be able to invest.
Yeah, I'd agree with all of that. In many ways, some people drew comparisons at the early days of lockdown with 2008. 2008 was very, very different. You know, it's where the money literally seized up in the system. And actually is one of the reasons why things like EIS and SEIS, because the individuals had cash and the institutions didn't. We've got an inversion of that to a certain extent. And really, Series A, Series B are happening, but they're being super picky. And what they're looking for is betting on the future. You're getting post-pandemic bets. So a lot of reg tech, a lot of digital tech, a lot of AI, a lot of what's the new world of retail, what's the new world of engagement, what's the new world of Internet of Things and devices as people look past the pandemic. So, you know, it's going to be very, very difficult in certain sectors. And in other sectors, you'll probably found that your investment cycles speeded up by a few months.
Amazing. Yeah, well, these are all been really, really good points, and thank you for sharing on it. It's really a pleasure to have you here. I'm just being conscious of the time. We have another fireside chat coming up. So lastly, do you have any kind of resources and things you want to share with our Startup Grind London community, or potentially some places where people can reach out to you if they want to learn more? Kenneth?
Yeah. Just add me on.
Okay.
It's just GARYSTEW, and always happy to chat and always happy to help other founders.
Same here. Find me on LinkedIn, and I'll do what I can.
Same with me. LinkedIn is a great way. We can immediately find out who we have in common virtually all the time. It's how you build your network, guys. See who you've got in common and then leverage it.
Well, thank you so much for sharing these thoughts with us and for being with us tonight. I wish you all the best, and please stick around. We're gonna be doing a virtual networking later on, so this is a opportunity for everyone to kind of get along later on. Enjoy. Bye.
And now let's go and jump in for the fireside chat of this evening. And I'm very happy to welcome a founder who started a company when he was 19. And this company, when you're starting a company for the first time, usually it's just too many unknowns and too many problems. So usually it doesn't work out. In his case, it did. And here we are. His company is now valued at around 2 billion and going very strong. So please welcome Markus Villig, the co-founder and CEO of BOLT.
Hello, everybody. Great to be here.
Hello, Markus. It's good to have you. It's good to have you here. And let's just jump in right away. I would like to ask you now the whole world changed and we are all working from different places. Where are you joining us from?
At the moment, I'm calling from my home in Tallinn. So living in Estonia, and our headquarters is here as well.
Okay. Markus, you started a company when you were 19, just after high school. Please tell us, what were you thinking about when you were finishing high school? Was it the first idea you had? You had several ideas, and about your thinking process of how you selected this idea to work on.
Sure. As long as I can remember, I've always been really into startups. I was already starting to pick up first coding lessons probably in 5th grade when I was maybe 12, 13 years old. And I was always following the tech space. So I had my first sort of real startup idea probably when I was 16. I was trying to build an educational app for all Estonian schools. And I realized pretty quickly that schools are not the best type of clients. They're pretty slow to sell, and they don't typically have a lot of money to pay either. So that's when I dropped that and then continued studying. And then during high school, I realized that in transportation, there's the biggest trends that will change the world over the next decade. As I saw, there was electric vehicles, autonomous driving, shared vehicles in the form of ride sharing, and so on. So that really seemed the place to be.
No problem. While we are waiting for Marian, I wanted to ask you a question, Markus. And it's in regards to your fundraising. Actually, when you were just starting, you came to London to pitch to many VCs. I'm not sure how many you met, but I heard it was unsuccessful. And, can you tell us more about that? It's a very interesting point.
Absolutely. I think fundraising is difficult for any founder, even if the company is doing well generally. And we were no exception. The very first funding we raised was from Estonian local angels, and that was relatively easy as it was a very modest amount of 100,000. But then when we started to raise anything bigger, over 1 million, the place to come to was London, as that's at the time where basically all the VC money was at in 2013-14. Met dozens of investors, and I heard what probably many of you founders are hearing as well, which is that sure, like you seem like a great guy. We would definitely back your next company because this industry seems to be taken. Nobody was willing to go and bet against Uber at the time. We basically had to survive for many years without raising really any funding at all, just bootstrapping.
I remember, when the whole boom started, the first speaker at Startup Grind was actually the founder of HaloCab, and Halo was at the time quite a big company, and it was even before Uber. And funny enough, it was the first speaker at Startup Grind in London. I remember it was in October in 2013. And at the time, the company was really huge, famous in Silicon Valley as well, had great investors. And I remember meeting the founder about 3 years later, and then it was the whole story upside down because the company was already in big trouble, and now the company doesn't exist. You managed to go the other way around. So you bootstrapped the company, made sure the basics are healthy, and then you went on to raise funding. And you mentioned earlier that you tried to speak to many investors, and it for some reason didn't resonate because they didn't want to bet against Uber. When did it change?
So in terms of background, when we started in 2013, there was almost no big successful transportation networks like us or Uber in Europe. I think Halo had raised some funding, but they were only working with taxis and only limited in a few cities. Uber had just launched the first cities in Europe, but they were mainly a premium limousine company. So in the first year, it was actually quite easy for us to raise the very first few 100,000 to get off the ground. But then what happened was that Uber suddenly managed to raise billions and billions of funding. And typically what happens is that when you have a company like that, they dominate the whole space. And most investors were just so stuck in that paradigm, they didn't even realize or consider that this could be different, because they had seen this pattern repeat over and over again with Google and Facebook, who came to dominate most of the Western world in their fields. But we had a very different attitude on this, because we actually saw the data from the first cities. And we started to plot out that the defensibility here is very different. And transportation is a very city-by-city game, where it doesn't really matter how large they are in the US, because that power doesn't really transition over to the markets we were operating in. We had a lot of confidence in our model. And I think it took us about 3-4 years to convince any big serious investors that was the case.
And how did you manage to convince them? Because
you had to raise around.
So you had the confidence to know that this is the case. But to the defense of the other argument, it's true that companies like Airbnb and so on, they do define the marketplace, and it's about the land grab in some markets. And you proved the other case. What were the arguments which you were using when you were meeting investors, and when did you see their demeanor starting to change and start to believe in a company like BOLT?
Well, ultimately, the best way we saw that worked was just to look at the data and really show the model that we were seeing in each of the cities we were in. Because high level, I think many investors and founders have got stuck in this mode of just thinking there's such a binary thing as network effects. And if you have it, it's a great business. If you don't have it, it's not. But in reality, it's not the binary thing at all. Network effects is a very sort of granular thing that matters a lot in that specific industry. What are the dynamics of that network effect? And absolutely, there are network effects in ride-hailing, meaning that if you have more drivers in a city, that improves the service and that lowers the customer arrival times, which brings in more customers. So the driver earnings go up, and then you get into this flywheel. But what we realized pretty early on was that this flywheel has a diminishing curve. So after some point, it doesn't really matter how many more drivers you have, or like every incremental driver adds you less and less value. And then when we just had this data from 5 cities, we could show how these charts were moving over time and prove to investors that Uber does not have defensibility that nobody can beat. But rather, once you hit the certain threshold, it's actually a market that we could enter as well.
That's very insightful. Now, when you start a company like this, you need to have a certain scale to be able to make a difference. But at the beginning, you just need to scale at a certain city level, and then you can expand from that. Today, BOLT is a company which is, if I'm not mistaken, the biggest car sharing platform in Europe. Is it true?
Yeah, overall, we're the biggest European ride-hailing company. We're actually next season already headed to be the biggest electric scooter company in Europe as well. And then in food delivery, we've been operating that for about a year. We're also one of the fastest growing companies.
So give us an idea about some numbers. So in how many countries are you present now?
Today, we're operating in 35 countries. We're doing
35.
35, yes, across Europe and Africa. And we are doing more than 2 billion euros of GMV on the platform, meaning the total volume of transactions in terms of rides and deliveries.
And how many riders is it? I've heard somewhere it's about 500,000. Is this true?
So we got about 500,000 drivers and couriers on the platform and tens of millions of customers.
That's very cool. What I find fascinating about a company, originally based in Estonia and then operating in many markets, is how different your markets are. And if we stay away yet from those niches which you operate in, like micromobility and food delivery, tell us about some surprising facts which you spotted in different markets. For example, in Europe, people like to call a car. In Africa, people like to call a motorbike. What are the key differences, and what have you learned when you were building this business about how different places in the world are?
Sure, there's massive differences when we look at the footprint we have. So for context, the first 3 years were operating mainly in Eastern Europe. So that was in the Baltics and then going south from there. Then we opened up in the first African countries, which was South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, and so on. And now the last 3 years, we've been expanding to Western Europe, like London. And each of those 3 geographies broadly has quite big differences. So one of the biggest things we saw was that Uber was actually operating in many of these African countries before us. But when we came in, we realized that they were doing such a poor job that we managed to surpass them in just a few years. Wow. So one of the examples, what we realized was that we came from Eastern Europe, where most of the transactions were happening in cash. Taxi drivers like to get cash because they get the money immediately. A lot of people didn't have credit cards, so electronic in-app payments were not common. So that was a natural thing for us. And of course, when we went to Africa, we adopted that as well. The funny thing was, Uber had not adopted cash payments in Africa until we entered. So actually, I mean, imagine you're operating in these countries which have 5% at most credit card penetration, and you actually miss out on 95% of the market because you don't even offer them a payment method. So I mean, that's one of the most obvious examples of these differences, just sort of that are very hard to understand from Silicon Valley if you're never on the ground. And of course, then you have a lot more local nuances there in terms of vehicle types and so on.
Okay, I wanna turn to the audience, and the audience, if you're listening, you can feel free to just ask a question on Slido. You have it in your browser. Markus, we have some questions from the audience, and the first one I would like to take is from Matthew. Matthew wants to know, when setting up BOLT, you needed to attract drivers to provide rides and deliveries. How do you do this without having a customer base?
So that's the trickiest part, and what creates defensibility in this business is that it's a marketplace. So it's a chicken and egg problem. You need to get the supply and the demand, and the problem is, in our case, you need to get it in real time. Because for
what did you do?
Sorry?
What did you do? How did you do it?
Yeah, so how we did it was that in the early days, I was just going on the street and signing up drivers one by one. So
really? Wow.
in when I was finalizing the product, while I was in high school, I literally was just going on the street every day, handing out leaflets and signing up drivers. And I did that for 3 months before we launched Tallinn. And we still replicate the similar strategy today, but of course we can now hire bigger teams and invest more money into marketing upfront. And
when you had the product, did you develop it yourself or use some kind of a clone of another app? How did you build the technology?
So at the very first version, I built half of it myself, and I used a local freelancer in Estonia to get the prototype out. And then I was lucky enough that 2-3 months later, I managed to get a great technical co-founder to join, who's still in the tech team.
And what have you learned when you were going around personally and trying to convince people, these taxi drivers? What was the reaction to that?
I must say the sales went really well. I think 90% of them immediately told me to get out of the car. And they
really?
Opening. Because imagine you have a 19-year-old guy coming to the car and saying, hey, sign up to the service that doesn't exist yet. And it took a lot of convincing for them to change their ways and come around.
And what insights did you do to improve your pitch when you were talking to these drivers?
Well, funnily enough, number one bottleneck was Russian. I was speaking very poor Russian, and most taxi drivers in Tallinn were Russian speaking. So I had to first of all fix that in a few months. And then it was my first job ever. So I really had to learn sales on the go. And after a few dozen attempts, I realized that most of them are very practical. So if you focus on them making more money, thanks to us taking lower commissions, that really works.
Yes. So you are the youngest unicorn founder in Europe right now. And a couple of years ago, we had the youngest self-made unicorn, youngest self-made billionaire, the co-founder of Stripe. And I've seen you had a chat with him, quite a nice one at Slash, I think, was it last year?
Yes.
And the Stripe founders are also known to be doing exactly the same thing. They were apparently, when they were starting the company, they were just going around coffee shops and try to see who would be a good customer, and try to convince people personally, which you can't scale, but it's a great lesson to understand the market and to see where the market is going. You said that you're still trying to do it today. How do you assign some time of your employees to do this, or you have certain teams who are focusing on this?
Well, at our scale, of course, most of that learning happens by looking at data, because it's very hard just for a product manager in Tallinn to understand how people across 35 countries are thinking. But what we do is that we have BOLT credit for employees, so we encourage people to regularly take rides and talk to drivers and collect feedback that way. And I myself don't even have a driver's license, so I'm fully reliant on using BOLT services on a daily basis, whether it's then ride sharing or scooters. And every week I discover something that can be improved, and I give feedback to the teams on that.
Okay, so I've heard that you don't have a driving license. Do you have it in the meantime, or you still don't have it?
No, still reliant on BOLT.
Okay, and so I understand the use case that if you live in a city, it's easy to do ride sharing. What do you do when you want to go for a weekend getaway and go with a car a couple of 100 kilometers away? How do you solve that?
So what we're actually doing is just addressing that problem in the next months, where we're looking to bring other types of vehicle rentals on the platform as well. So, for example, today we offer you, for example, a scooter that you can rent for 30 minutes or so. But we're looking at bringing there also vehicles that you could rent for a couple of days. So we think that's going to be the solution here. So people would not need to buy a car.
Okay, so I wanna go slightly back to the questions from Slido, which ask how do you get the early customers on board? So you explained to us how you get taxi drivers, but the trickiest part, if your company is not known, is how do you get people to use your app? So how do you do it at the beginning?
Well, actually, our philosophy on that has been the same from the start, which is that the best way to grow is just to have the best product. So we've always been really frugal on marketing spend, and everything we can, we rather save and invest back into the service.
Sure, but how do you get customers to use it?
And we just get it from word of mouth. Even today, 80-90% of customers that join us come because of a friend's recommendation. So what we just do is to make sure we have the best availability, we have great prices, and customers just spread the word. So typically, the only thing we do generally in the beginning is some Facebook advertising, and we focus on a great PR launch, and then we get the first customers, and they get such a good experience that we get this flywheel going. And we've seen the same across 35 countries now. We just focus on having great prices and great service.
Okay, and how long does the flywheel need to establish a certain level of customer base to be sufficient?
That depends on the city, but generally that means tens of thousands of rides per week to have a critical mass that's self-sustainable.
Mm-hmm. Yes. One thing I like about the way Bolt is run, as opposed to Uber, who has tens of thousands of employees, is that you very frugal, and the way you explained you run the company is like a federation of startups, which makes the company very flexible and also easier to react to the market. Now, what is the downside of running sets of companies which are fairly flexible and don't need to approve everything from the headquarters? What is the downside to that?
Well, it's always a trade-off between having more centralization or more decentralization. And in our case, what we've opted for is that we want to have more flexibility on the country level. But what it means is that there's a lot of duplicate efforts, for example, and we keep repeating some mistakes. Because countries might not know what other countries are doing, as they operate pretty independently in most of the cases. So what we try to do is to have some lessons that we share. So twice a year, we bring country teams together so they can share best practices, for example, to minimize this sort of duplicate learnings. But I think it's generally a good trade-off to make, and we're rather optimized to have more freedom, not only in the country teams, but also in the product teams, so that they get to make most decisions and they own their own KPIs.
Okay, you're mentioning product teams, and we have a question regarding the product about Slido. And the question is, what techniques did you use for building a great product?
Well, high level, we are trying to balance not only being data-driven, but also just using common sense. Because what we realize is that every A/B test takes time. And instead of trying to do 10 or whatever A/B tests, we rather just, first of all, try to do a bit more research, more planning, and save engineering time that way. I think that's been one of the important philosophies. But other than that, we just really use the product on a daily basis ourselves. So we very quickly learn what works and doesn't work, and rely on that internal experience.
Okay, you mentioned that your each market is quite different from other markets, and you are quite flexible in this regard. Does the product look the same across all the markets?
Mostly it's the same. I'd say about 10-20% is something that we localize. So for example, some elements of the design, some features, payment methods, for example. So there's some localization.
Today I was taking a ride using Bolt, and I usually ask drivers how happy they are with the service. I'm doing it for maybe 5 years now. And usually they give me interesting insights. Sometimes they give me urban legends like we discussed earlier that, they tell me you used to work at Uber before, but you confirmed you didn't because this is your first job and you were 19 when you started Bolt. But the feedback I got today, I asked the driver, what is one key feature which you would love to have in the app, which there is not today? And the driver said, many customers are asking about a opportunity to be able to book a ride for a certain time. So, for example, I'm going to the airport, or I'm coming from the airport, but this is something which Uber does. You don't do it. Is there a reason for that?
Yeah, I think that's one of the examples of how we approach product design overall, or product strategy, which is that high level, how we see it is that we should aim to not ever actually even need this feature, because our core promise is that you can always use Bolt to get around. So there should never even be a situation where you need to pre-book, because there should always be a car available nearby. So that's number one. Number two is that based on the research we've done, we've seen that actually this feature is only being used by less than 1% of the price. So it's such a minor thing that we rather focus on other things that we actually see add more impact there, and customers actually value higher.
So you're saying you had the feature and it didn't work, so you removed it?
No, we've actually never built it out, because all our research has shown that it's actually not that valuable to people, because we have so good coverage, people don't generally even need it.
Okay, fair enough. Fair enough. Now, let's discuss a little bit more about the funding part, because that's very interesting. Your first investors were your parents, and it was compared to other investors. How hard was it to convince your parents to lend you the money compared to VCs?
I think it was probably the most challenging round I've done, because I was 19, I had no idea what I'm really doing, and then I went to my parents saying, "Hey, I need this 5,000 euros to get this off the ground." And they said, "We've been saving this money for you to go to university. If you spend it all, then you gotta work all the time you're in uni to cover your rent." And if I hadn't done proper research before that, I probably would have bailed. But by that time, I had this months and months of experience of building the product, talking to drivers. So it took me like 2 seconds to decide that, okay, let's go ahead, let's do this thing. But it took a lot of months before to gather that confidence.
Mm-hmm. So your parents are now, the loan was converted into shares, so they are happy shareholders, right? And do you also have a brother who is working at the company?
Yeah, actually, we have 3 co-founders. One of them is my older brother.
Was he helping you with convincing your parents?
He was actually one of the investors. I think he put in about 1,000 euros as well.
Oh, wow. So you must be a happy co-founder as well. Now, when you look at the investor base which you have right now, so you have VCs, you have the friends and family, and you did a smart move in the strategic sense, because you started to get on board some strategic investors. The first one, or one of the biggest ones, was DT, and DT is a company which is known to have a big battle with Uber in some markets, and especially in China. And then Uber decided to move away because they were not able to fight with Uber, Didi in China. And Didi does this quite a lot. That Didi kind of teams up with the competitor of Uber in certain markets. How do you see the value coming from Uber being your investor?
So high level
from Didi, yes.
Sure. I think Didi had a very brilliant strategy 3-4 years ago, where they realized that there was a lot of competitors that were actually doing well, like us, but investors were not recognizing that opportunity yet. So there was a big gap in sort of reality and perception. So they actually approached us in 2016, realizing that A, it's overall just a good investment, because most VCs were missing out on us, and B, it actually helped Didi because Uber then had more competition around the world. So they made a number of investments like this, and they were very supportive in the early days. But what has happened since is that we've grown to be a large company. I mean, we're one of the biggest tech companies in Europe, growing 100% year over year, 35 countries. And now it's more about localization and going deep into the geographies we're in. So there hasn't been that much sort of advice we could have shared between us and Didi in the last 3 years already.
I understand. Your second big strategic investor is a car producer, Daimler, Mercedes. Why did you decide to have them coming in as investors, and what do you expect from this value?
Sure. So Daimler is one of the biggest car makers in the world, and we realized that long term, we think partnering with more OEMs will make sense, because at the end of the day, especially if the market moves to autonomous driving, we need to have some strong allies. So they were the OEM that we liked the most, that seemed to be the most innovative and forward-looking.
Okay, so this is the investor part now. You started as a car sharing company, and then you started to move in to other niches. Did you think the car sharing was not enough for you? Why did you decide to discover other markets before you conquered properly this car sharing platform?
Well, the reality is that as we're in 35 countries, there's about 20 of them where we are already the market leader for many years. So when we look at most of Eastern Europe, most of Africa, then BOLT is today the largest ride-hailing company in those countries. And we still continue to grow well. But what we see is that there's a big opportunity to add more services on top of it. So one of the things we've always been thinking about is to add small vehicles to the platform, because we're not massive fans of cars. We think generally the better future would be if less people own cars. They would be more shared and there would be smaller vehicles. It's better for cities, better for traffic. So we were looking at this for many years already, and we finally decided to enter that market in 2018.
And when you look at the P&L now, are you happy with coming in? Because we had this this conference, Startup Grind Europe, I think 2 years ago, and it was a big theme because the micromobility was becoming a super hot topic, and as any hot topic, it just gets too hot and then it comes down and then it slowly takes off again. And it was a wave. I'm sure you remember many four-letter companies were getting lots of investments, and some of them are not around anymore. You decided to move into this space, and do you still see this space as strategically important for you, or is it just a nice addition to the main business model of car sharing?
Well, we've actually been big believers in it, as I said already, for many years. So in 2018, when we launched, we were actually the first ride-hailing company in the world to launch electric scooters in the same app, so that you could use one app for multiple services. We did that before Uber and Lyft and everybody else. And that bet has really proven to work really well. So we're actually been every year since then now doubling down. And as I said earlier, we're actually going to be the biggest electric scooter operator in Europe next year. We're going to be in the market with more than 100,000 scooters. So we do see that it makes a lot of sense for consumers. It adds a lot of value. And it's actually good business for us uniquely, because we can operate it in this ecosystem of multiple services. So what we see is that on its own, scooters are not that profitable of a business. But when you have a ride-hailing network, then that means that you can actually share all of the costs in terms of customer acquisition. You can share many of the HQ fixed administrative costs and so on. And that's why it makes a lot of sense for us.
Yes. And the last part you're present at is food delivery. And I have to admit, I didn't use BOLT for this yet, but I've heard from several friends of mine that they love to use this option, and apparently much more than the Uber Eats. That's what I've heard. Why is it?
Yeah.
What makes this part so attractive for users?
Well, high level, our philosophy across all of these services is the same as it is in ride-hailing, which is that as a company, we try to be internally as frugal as possible. And I think a good analogy here is that many people think Amazon is a frugal company. How we like to think about it is that we're like Amazon that was founded in Soviet Union. So it's like even more frugal by a big extent. So that has been a core part of the DNA for us from the start. And that means that we are offering better commission to restaurants, so they make more money. We offer more earnings to couriers, so they make more money. That means more couriers come to us. And very importantly, we offer lower delivery fees for the customer. So you basically get equivalently as good or a faster service for less money. So what's there not to like? And it's the same with scooters and the same with ride-hailing.
Okay, now let's look at some questions from the audience. There's a question here from somebody who wants to stay anonymous, and he or she wants to know, in the next decade, we are expecting self-driving taxis to become the new normal. How do you see BOLT competing in this landscape? I've heard you speaking somewhere that you don't believe in this space yet. Did your view evolve, or are you still skeptical about this being the case on the market very soon?
Well, long-term, autonomous driving will absolutely be a huge change to the world. But we have good relations with all the big players in the field, and we see that nothing is going to happen at least for 5 years, more likely 10 years. Because the technology is not ready, and the regulation will take many, many years to evolve. So for now, we're more focused on the short term. What can we actually do today? For example, in the field of scooters and e-bikes, where we see a much more tangible, immediate result.
I see. Regarding your pool of devices like micromobility scooters and so on, you also had a few bicycles with e-bikes. Is that correct?
Correct.
How do you see this business model of having to acquire some pool of devices And where do you stop? Do you stop at e-bikes and scooters, or you go beyond having a pool of motorcycles and so on? How do you think about it?
So on the ride-hailing side, we already have lessons from this. So we started with taxis, then we expanded to all drivers, private drivers as well, and then we expanded, for example, to motorcycles in Africa and tuk-tuks in some countries. So we see that there is a demand for different type of vehicles in different cities. And it's absolutely the same on the micromobility side. So we started with electric scooters because that's the form factor that works really well in most cases. But we recognize e-bikes are better, for example, for long distances. And we're also looking at regular bikes, at mopeds, and other types of vehicles there.
Okay, let's spend a few minutes on legislation, because this is something where legislation was a big case for these new economies, and the sharing economy was a very big new thing. And we remember there was this battle of Uber and Bolt in London, especially, and we are starting in London. What was the case at the beginning when you were thinking of launching in London? The TfL, the Transport for London, was quite strict. Can you tell us what was the process and how did you finally manage to launch in London?
Sure. I must say that we operate in 35 countries, and Transport for London, or TfL, is by far the sort of this regulator with the highest expectations, the highest standards. And we actually have a whole big dedicated team just working on London on the product and safety side to make sure that we're fully compliant. And we've been now working on it for, I think, about 2.5 years before we got our first license. And we've only doubled down our efforts since then. So I must say it's really a long, difficult process to get in. And it's an order of magnitude even more than what we see in most other countries. And I think that's one of the cases that many other companies, for example, like Uber and Ola, underestimated. So I think they did not invest enough there, and now, I mean, the sort of results and conflicts that are apparent from that. While we sort of recognized in the last 3 years it's a big area, we're continuously investing there, and I think our relations with TfL are now better than ever before.
Do you expect any other big regulational issues coming in the near future regarding self-driving cars or anything similar?
Well, how I see it is that every new industry takes 3 to 5, 10 years to get settled down. So in ride-hailing, similarly, there was no regulation in most of Europe 5 years ago, but now actually most countries have regulation. So whether it's in Estonia, Poland, whatnot, most countries now have licensing in place. And we think same thing is going to happen with scooters. It's already happening in the first cities, and likely in 2-3 years, all European cities will have scooter licenses as well. And probably, I mean, self-driving cars will take even longer because, for example, in Germany, it has taken 7-8 years to even recognize ride-sharing as an industry. So I think actually recognizing fully self-driving cars is going to be more difficult.
Yes, I remember, when you were starting, you also mentioned somewhere in an interview that it was fairly easy to take off in Eastern Europe because in Eastern Europe the prices of taxis were not so high as in Western Europe. Yet the services, me being from Slovakia originally, I remember the services of taxi drivers, especially in Prague and these big cities, were horrible. And what your industry changed, they changed the way that people can leave feedback, and the feedback is not going to get lost somewhere. Because it's very hard for me to complain about that taxi driver when I have no way of telling others to warn them against this taxi driver. It's super easy with an app like BOLT. Now, when it comes to the feedback and changing the perceptions of customers, do you find it easier for Eastern European customers to get used to something new like BOLT, or is it easier in Western Europe?
I'd actually say that what we've seen is the fastest growing segment for us is even in Africa. So Europe, in comparison, is actually being quite slow. And I think that there's a number of reasons behind it. One is that on the supply side, most of our African markets where we operate have far higher unemployment levels than in Europe. So most of them have 20-25% unemployment, and that means there's tens of thousands of people looking for work. So there was a massive opportunity for us as a platform to actually give an opportunity for these people to actually start driving. And then on the other side of it, there's actually very few transportation options available. Most people don't own a car, Public transport is actually very poorly available in most cities. So actually there was a big demand side as well. So it was just very natural for us to bring the two sides together. While in Europe, sure, we see great growth as well, almost 100% year over year. But just the problems we're solving here compared to Africa in terms of safety and other value we add is actually relatively smaller.
There's a question here on Slido which I like, and I would like to ask you that. The question is, please describe your typical day schedule. Was it any different when you just started? What do you do today, typically? Describe to us your normal working day.
Well, it has changed significantly over time. As we've built a team now, 1,700 people, I am lucky enough to be able to delegate most things. But for example, today was a good example. I was having 3-4 hours of meetings with our engineering and product teams, reviewing what they're doing, what are the problems, how can I support, how do we want to build the organization, and then we want to hire more than 100 engineers next year, so planning out which locations and so on. Then I had a couple of interviews as we're hiring, for example, a team of who will head our investor relations. So thinking through the strategy there, how do we want to approach investors over the next years, when do we want to go public, and so on. And then a few hours of administrative side of figuring out, for example, which countries have which problems in terms of HR, rolling out some new policies, and so on. So it's a pretty typical day.
Regarding activities which you really enjoy, tell us, what do you really enjoy about your job? Which part of it do you consider a reward?
Two things come to mind. One is overall just actually hearing feedback from customers who really like the service. That's always great. So one thing is to see the numbers, tens of millions of trips happening on the platform, and how we are able to save money for drivers. But another thing is that I'm using Bolt on a daily basis. So for example, wherever I travel to a new city, I ask drivers how they like it. And them actually then saying like, hey, it's great you came here. I'm now making more money than I did before. It's just really great to see you're actually having a big tangible impact on the world. And the other part,
do you tell them who you are when you speak to them?
Sometimes I do, but usually at the end, so I get honest feedback. But the other part is seeing the team grow. So we've been very lucky that most of the team we've hired over the last 5 and 7 years are still with us and have grown with the organization. We've actually not had to bring in that many sort of senior people, but we've been able to actually grow the team we have in Tallinn. And then it's just great to see them at some point also going on and then starting their own companies based on the experience they've acquired here. And I think that's something that really boosts the Estonian and the Baltic startup community overall.
Yes, in the Baltics, Estonia is a fairly small country, and I remember I was there to visit your president with a few other tech CEOs, and I was impressed how closely linked the ecosystem is, how you all help each other. Do you also try to give back to the community? Do you mentor other founders? How are you connected to the local ecosystem?
Estonia is extremely unique here. I think, first of all, we have actually the most tech unicorns per capita of any other country. We've actually had 4 unicorns in Estonia, which is a country of like 1.3 million people. So
is it Bolt, TransferWise?
Then we have actually, yes, Skype was founded here, and the fourth company most people might not know about in sort of gaming space as well. So actually it's been pretty interesting over the last 20 years. And what this has created is that we actually have a Slack chat with all Estonian founders. There's like hundreds of people there, and people are sharing learnings and lessons and for example, fundraising there on a weekly basis. So yeah, I'm also mentoring and investing in some startups here every year.
That's awesome. Let's take some more questions from Slido quickly. We have like the last 5 minutes. I want to take a company. I want to take a question from an anonymous user. He wants to know, as a company, you offer the best fares for drivers and end users. How do you drive profitability? Is it through selling advertising space?
No, actually, we have a very strict sort of fundamental view on that, which is that we just keep our costs low, and that means that we can still be profitable even with a 15% commission. We don't need to take 25% commission to be there. So high level, what we have is that our cost structure is so low that out of 100 euros, we typically have costs of maybe 7 euros to handle that volume. So that means that 15% commission is plenty for us still to have a decent profit margin.
I noticed that you run quite often some promotions, and these promotions are either directed at consumers, so you subsidize the prices, or at drivers. Are you able to make it profitable over the year, or you still subsidize those this growth to make sure you can gain some market share?
Well, it depends on many factors, but most of all, it depends exactly on our size in that city. So as discussed earlier, we always need to invest in the early days to reach critical mass, to have enough drivers and riders for the ecosystem to start to have this flywheel effect. And then after that, we don't really need to invest anymore because the service is already getting better by the week organically. So I think that's probably one of the things that that again was hard to convince to investors, because they saw that you had to make these big upfront investments, and it was unclear whether it will be profitable later. Now we have 7 years of data to show that that's the case.
Yes. I'd like to ask you a bit about your challenges and how you solve them. So when you were building this company, you were literally, you had no experience. You were 19 and you were an open book, but you also didn't have an experience which normal founders, who are a bit older, they already have. What made you believe that you can learn so much and so quickly while managing people, because managing people is also something which is hard to do? How did you go about it, and what is the secret how you made it happen and learn over the years?
Well, I think you always need to have a healthy balance in terms of psychology of, on one hand, being confident and believing in yourself that you can do it, but on the other hand, being extremely self-critical and constantly learning from others and evaluating whether your own beliefs are true. And I think we've been lucky enough to have a founding team that has always been like that. So we're always very agnostic that, okay, we're not doing a good job, everybody should give us criticism so we can improve. And we've been lucky enough to build a culture where that's the case, and people are openly sharing these problems, and that's what's accelerating learning. Some people might say that it's sort of rude or maybe not polite to give people this critical feedback, but generally we have a culture where everybody understands that it comes from a sort of good place. And the other thing is just actually a lot of online material. We're living in a lucky time at the moment where there's great YouTube videos, books available, so you can learn how great companies are built. And I've been just spending a lot of time reading through that material as well.
You mentioned you have now 1,700 people in your company.
Yes.
What kind of people do you interview? Is it just the management, or you still try to be as present at many interviews?
That has changed significantly over time. So in the last 2 years, I'm mainly only interviewing senior managers in the company. So of course, my reports and generally their reports. But what I do instead is that we have regular surveys, and I do skip level meetings with people of different parts of the organization. So I actually get to hear directly from people, not through 3 layers of managers.
When it comes to culture, do you still, for example, when you're visiting your subsidiaries in other countries, what do you watch out for, and what kind of activities which are linked to the culture of the company do you correct to make sure it's still a company which you would enjoy working at?
The number one thing is really thinking like an owner. So because we have this structure of 35 country teams and each of them is pretty independent, then this only works in case they actually have the motivation to get their work done. Because from HQ, we can't be there every day holding their hand and pushing them, but we need people who take initiative. And it's really hard, to find these great entrepreneurial people who have that drive. But what we actually see is that we're upfront. It's going to be very difficult, but the people who embrace those challenges, who actually want to learn and effectively be a founder in that country, they work really well, and generally they need quite low maintenance.
Okay, we have a question here from Rolf Greenwald, and he would like to know, how did you find your technical co-founder, and what did you offer to attract them? And are they still with the company? You mentioned you had this freelancer, right?
Yeah, so the very first version I did with the freelancer, but then I realized pretty quickly I need somebody fully committed for long-term on the technical side. So I just literally started posting to different forums until a few people reaced out, and then I met.
What kind of forums? On Facebook or Reddit? Which kind of platform?
At the time, it was like local developer forums in Estonia. So just very, very small stuff. And then a few people replied, met them. One of them was so interested, he actually built a prototype of the service of literally the app in just a couple of days. He just came to me like, hey, here's the rider app, here's the driver app, it works. And that for me was such a strong signal the person really cares. I mean, we hadn't even agreed on anything. He already built a prototype that I was on the spot like, okay, just join the team. I'm so happy to have you. Of course, at the time I had no money, literally zero budget. So he just got equity in the company, and then he's still with us today.
Good. Another question here is how do you guarantee that there are enough cars around, especially during lockdown when more people are staying at home? How do you motivate the drivers? Is it through money, through sharing more share of the ride with them?
So mainly what we do is that we have this automatic dynamic pricing system, which looks at the ratio of demand and supply and then corrects the pricing in real time wherever needed. So it's basically a big data science model that predicts demand, predicts supply, and then sends out communications and changes the pricing as needed.
I've heard that you have these two segments of drivers, those ones who like to drive in the night and those ones who like to drive in the day. And apparently, I heard some drivers complain that those people who usually drive in the night have nothing to do because people can't go out. And so now we have more drivers during the day. How do you solve these kind of problems?
Well, exactly the same method. So we have an algorithm that predicts the demand during the day and looks at the supply. And for example, we see that there's too much demand, then we just send out communications to drivers informing them that we really need them at that time, and we potentially raise the prices, and we might offer some additional bonuses for them to come out. And then vice versa, in the other situation, we might consider lowering the prices for a promotional campaign for some period.
Yes. You mentioned that your brother is also a co-founder, and you were 3 co-founders. Today, the company is big. You probably have a board. Do you still keep your founder meetings separate from the board, or they are joined now? Well,
the management team actually today doesn't consist of the founders. It's me and then my direct reports. 2 other founders we have in the company are not on the management level, but they are running smaller teams. But the management team operates fully independently with just the leadership and the decision making of the founders. So we don't have anything close to like an investor controlled company. All the decisions of where we invest, which markets we go to, are made by the team.
Okay, we'll be wrapping up now. But do you have any advice for young people? It was also a question on Slido for young people who are starting and not sure they're going to make it. Are there any tricks which you use when you were starting?
Biggest tip is not to give up. Over the years, I've heard every single different sort of complaint you could get or excuse of why investors don't want to invest, why people don't want to join. Either Uber is too big, or then in the scooter field, you don't know anything about hardware, or then in deliveries, like, yeah, it's such a complicated space, so many players. And every single time, we've just done a thorough analysis. We believe in ourselves. We keep executing. And then a few years later, everybody looks back and sees that it's sort of obvious it worked, even though they were telling us themselves it will not work. So gotta have confidence.
Yeah, when you say it like that, it sounds super easy. And we all know how hard it is. Markus, I want to ask you one last question. Is you have somebody who has the same name as you, Usain Bolt, the fastest man in the world, and one of your competition, which probably doesn't exist anymore, they hired him as an ambassador, and you had to solve it. And can you tell us about how did you solve this?
Yeah, actually, it's probably been one of the easier problems we've had to solve over the years. But the case was that actually last year, when all the scooter boom was happening and we were already growing well in Europe, one Uber investor decided that he wants to make a new scooter company. He also named it Bolt, despite us actually having the trademark for Bolt in Europe. And then he tried to do a workaround, so he actually managed to convince Usain Bolt, the runner, to be an ambassador for them. So they tried to use this as a sort of hack to get into European market. But as we had the trademark, of course, they couldn't do it. So the courts actually told them to stop, and I don't think they exist anymore.
Okay, are you thinking of maybe teaming up with Usain Bolt this time around with your company?
Why not?
Without any problems?
Yeah, I think he would be rather pretty happy to work with us.
There you go. Yeah. Markus, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it, because this is something which is super important, just to inspire, especially young people, because now during the pandemic, people are staying more at home and they have more time to think about the building company. And I fully agree with the idea that you just keep going and don't give up and keep learning along the way. I want to ask you the last question: is there anything which we can do to help you, or BOLT?
I think two things. One is, as we talked here, feedback is very good. So whoever uses BOLT in London, any of our services, really, you can just shoot feedback to the team. We're happy to get it and improve. Again, we have a mindset that we're nowhere near done yet. So if you see any problems, we're happy to change. And secondly, we're always hiring. So if anybody is considering of joining one of our country teams or joining one of our new product teams, we're really looking for great people.
Okay, we are happy to share the link if there's any link where you have jobs. We can find that and share it with the attendees afterwards. And we'll be also streaming this talk on social media next week, so we'll be adding the link. Markus, thank you for being here. We really appreciate it. I hope BOLT will be. BOLT is just at the beginning right now, and there's many more countries to conquer. Don't stop at 35.